Today, all right. If anybody did not get the handout, I can get it to you afterwards. So if you get, please let me know. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you for all that you've given to us. Thank you that you are full service, that you reach out to us, you reveal yourself to us, you draw us to you, you help us through our lives, you create in us your spirit, you give us your fruit. Well, and it keeps going on and on and on. Father, thank you for what you do. Please bless this teaching, and we ask you to please bless the class. In Jesus' name. All right, Presbyterians and Methodists we're going to go into today. So we're only, now, because we don't have a ton of more classes, many more classes, we're only going to be hitting the major guys. So we're going to get Presbyterians, Methodists, Unitarians, Baptists, Quakers, and Charismatics. So those are the guys we're still going to go over. But today we're going to go over Presbyterians and Methodists because in the time frame, this is exactly where they fell. So Lutherans came first with Anabaptists right during the Lutherans. Presbyterians came next. The next major one was the Methodists. So let's talk about that. Oops, let's get these guys on here. Woo-hoo. All right. What is a liturgical church? Well, a liturgical church basically is, a church that has very strict worship. Meaning that a lot of times what they do is they actually have prayer books. Meaning that they have a book that they go by and they read prayers out of and they do things out of. And it's, the Catholics are a liturgical church. Episcopals, of course. Also Anglicans, a liturgical church. So the more that you do stricter forms of work, that's more what the liturgical churches are. Presbyterians, in some ways, are liturgical churches, in some ways not. So, but as we see that as you go from the 15th, 16th, 17th century on, churches are going to become less liturgical as we go. So, which means they're going to be more free. People are they're going to have more freedom in church and things like that. Now, but the thing is, I have to say that people like tradition, and I don't think there's nothing wrong with tradition. So tradition is very good because what it does, people kind of feel comfortable with tradition. And if you don't, to help you understand this, how many antique things do you guys have in your house? Why do you like them? Well, because they're kind of cool. I like antique stuff. It's fun. It's interesting. So people kind of feel good with worship, and I don't find there's any problem with this kind of this. But the thing is, what we need to understand is tradition is something that really happened in the beginning, and as Protestantism went along, it became less and less. We don't want to say creeds. We don't want to read from prayer books. We want more open and free worship. And that's fine. But the one thing I will say is that one thing that did happen is that Protestantism, in my opinion, became more sterile as time went on, that we kind of lost some of our history. And it's interesting because there was actually this one Christian history magazine that really talks about regaining the history. What can we learn from our people of the past, and what can we learn from these wonderful people in the past? So that's kind of the difference in tradition churches. All right, before we go into it, we need to talk about where we're at when it comes to Presbyterianism and the Reformed Church. Now, Switzerland, which is where my family's from, was the big hot spot for that. Now, and if you want to know kind of where Switzerland is, the reason why it was a hot spot is if you look at there, France is to the west, Italy to the south, Austria to the east, and Germany to the north. Literally, it was right in between everything. So when it spread from there, it was like one of the big places where things spread from. So we've got to understand that when we talk Switzerland, which is a big thing with Reformed, that this is where everybody kind of came from and everything spread outwards. All right, Reformed faith and Presbyterianism. Well, Reform basically means something that, a guy named Zwingli did. Basically what Reformed was that basically what they wanted to do is they did not want to go exactly do what the Lutherans did. They're very similar to Lutherans, but they called themselves Reformed. So they call themselves, instead of Lutherans, they're Reformed. Now, we eventually will call them Presbyterians, okay? But in the beginning, they called themselves Reformed. Most churches state their beginning under John Calvin. However, John Calvin is not who started it. He was just the big guy in the midst of it. This is the guy that started it, Zwingli. Now, Zwingli was a Swiss patriot. Now, one of the things about the Swiss we need to understand, and I know I've talked about before, was that the Swiss actually was a big hot spot for mercenaries. Mercenaries. Now, why do you need mercenaries? Well, I guess everybody needs mercenaries, I guess. But the reason why they got into this was because of the Black Plague. Now, we call the Black Plague only because what happened was Yersinia pestis infected people, and they would get these humongous black boobles. Basically, their lymph nodes would come out to here on their legs and everything, and they would turn completely black. And that's why they call it the Black Plague. So that wiped out about half of Europe and half of the peasant population. No peasant population. You have the landlords could have no one to fight for them, so they had to go look elsewhere for people to fight for them. And that's where Switzerland jumped in. Switzerland wanted to become free of everybody else, so they become big into the mercenaries. So what happened was that Zwingli actually was a Reformed person, and he actually led under Erasmus. And if you ever read about Erasmus was actually one of the smartest guys around. He was extremely smart, but he never wanted to go completely. Even Luther was like, no, we got to go farther. Erasmus was like, let's take this really slow. So, but he, like many of these guys, Zwingli learned under him. Now, so what he did is he really started to build the Reformed faith. However, one of the things he did, he was really one of the first guys that went to battle with the mercenaries. He followed the Swiss mercenaries in battle, and he went to multiple things because he wanted to minister to them. So in the midst of trying to begin the Reformed faith, he also went out, but unfortunately that was his undoing, because he got killed in battle in 1531. So Zwingli was that. Now let me for Church of Christ, don't be interested in this, because Zwingli basically did not like instruments in his worship. However, the reason why he did not like instruments in his worship was because he said they were distracting. That's a decent idea. I don't think that's a bad thing. But he was the big guy for that. And a lot of Church of Christ people look at Zwingli as being one of the first outside the early church that actually began with having instruments. Heinrich Bullinger. Now, Bullinger really was the main guy. If you want to have one guy that's going to be Reformed, that's this guy. This guy was prolific. I mean, this guy wrote around 12,000 sermons and letters. The guy wrote tons of stuff. And he was one of the big guys. And he was really more active in the beginning than Calvin was. And to be honest, Calvin was not really as active as everybody thinks he was. He just did something that everybody used. We'll get to that in a second. So Henry Bullinger replaced Zwingli in Switzerland and became the main voice for the Reformed faith. So Calvin. Everybody likes Calvin, wants to talk about Calvin. Calvin was born in France. He was French. So he was trained as a lawyer. And let me just say, you ever met the guy that's like the smartest guy in the room? Well, that's Calvin. Calvin was so stinking smart. And, he wasn't actually the nicest guy. I don't think he was mean. I just think he was just really, really smart, and it was hard to talk to the guy. Well, anyway, he became a Protestant in the early 1530s. But one of the problems in the early 1530s is the Huguenots were starting to be persecuted. However, in the midst of it, now it's interesting, he became a Protestant in 1530. Now think about this. This is how smart this guy is. Okay? He wrote his Institutes on Christian Religion. Basically, that's the book basic book on Christian beliefs. It was big. It took him, he did that in 6 years. He literally no one knew a lot of this stuff because they stopped doing it. And so what he did, he went back to the best guy, which is who? Augustine. Augustine was the guy. He went back to Augustine, read all this, and he wrote his Institutes. And that changed everything. He was amazing. In 6 years after becoming a Protestant, I can't even imagine. That's really good. Now, his book wasn't as big, but within about 10 years, it got really big. And the Institutes is considered one of the greatest Christian works in Protestantism. Now, so he got that going. He brought, the new Institutes out. And today, pretty much everybody's built on his works. Most Protestant Christians have built on Calvin's works. So again, it's kind of like, we look at Athanasius, we look at Augustine, we look at people like Clement, we look at people, those guys, everybody built on their stuff. We would not be here without them, and thus we would not be here without John Calvin. John Calvin was amazing. We can't keep this, just because he was a predestination guy in our mind, we can't just say, oh, he's a bad guy because of that. He did do that, but just remember, a lot of what we have today is because of him. So he's one of the heroes of the faith. All right. Calvin comes to Switzerland. So Calvin was fleeing the French. Sadly, I would be fleeing the French too. Remember what we talked about? It was bad. Remember my paper and everything? It wasn't good. So Calvin was fleeing the French. And so he came to Switzerland. He met a guy named William Farel, who convinced him to stay on as a pastor. Now, when I said convinced, that's a nice way to say it. He shamed him into doing it. He had no desire to stay on and be a pastor. He wanted to write. He wanted to teach. He wanted to go and do university stuff and all this. But he's like, no, we really need you. Because by this time he had the Institutes out. So, reluctantly, he gave in. Well, sadly, that was not what Geneva, where he went, wanted. He was pretty hardcore. He was hardcore in his beliefs. He was hardcore in how you need to run churches, how you need to run people and do everything else. And the leaders of Geneva did not like that. See, we've got to remember the church and the state. The state runs everything. The church is based upon what the state wants at this time. Okay? We've got to have that understanding, because you're not going to get what's all going on here unless you really got that. That the state really ran everything. And so the leaders of Geneva said, we're out of here. You're out of here. So they pretty much said, you're gone. And so they kicked Calvin out. Okay? So Calvin's he felt terrible and everything else, but it wasn't a bad thing for him, because, he finally, about 5 years later, after he matured a little bit, grew up a little bit, changed a few things, brought a few things different, did things this way, they actually went to him and said, all right, you know what? We like you. Let's come on. You can come on back. And so really the whole town celebrated. So they booted him. Then they asked him to come back. But he was a changed man by this time. God can do a lot of things in people. And God really worked in Calvin. And he softened him a little bit. So by that time, things had changed. But literally, what's really weird about this is that, so it was funny, because the last sermon he preached before they booted him, he literally picked up from that and taught the next exact sermon 5 years later. I mean, he literally was that good. He's like, okay, I taught this, and now let's just pick right up and where we left off. Pretty amazing guy. Very smart guy. And if you haven't ever read the Institutes, I really recommend it. It's very, very good. All right, but he also did something called the Constabulary. Now, if you remember my paper, my fictional paper with that guy, my guy in a fiction, the Constabulary was the people that basically said, you will learn these things. People were required to learn everything in German now. What were they learning? What did they have to know? What language did they have to know prior to this? Latin. Yes, remember, everything was in Latin. Think Catholic, think Latin. And does anybody know when the Catholic Church reversed their stance on Latin? 1960s, yeah. 1960s. Yeah, it was a long time. So in a sense, it was good that they had to learn it in Latin. So they had to learn the creed in Latin. They had to learn the Lord's Prayer in Latin. They had to learn in Swiss. They had to learn everything in Swiss, which was good, but you got to remember, most of these people couldn't read and write. Only about 10% of the people could read and write at this time. So everything was very difficult for them. Very difficult. So constabulary was it was basically, we're running the city as a Christian city, and that's the way it's going to be. So, and if you ever want, there's a good, if you ever go into, want to read a good thing, Christian History Magazine on Calvin was amazing, because what it was, basically what the Christian History Magazine said what the constabulary did, and they, basically, if you fought with somebody, you're going to get in trouble. If you punched somebody, you're going to get in trouble. If you said bad things about someone, you're going to get in trouble. So the constabulary was pretty hardcore. But it did keep everything, I guess for the time it was fine. All right, John Knox. Now, I always love this guy because I love the last name Knox, because that was my very favorite third and fourth grade teacher was Mr. Knox. My mom hated the guy. She called him a hippie. She's like, oh, that guy's just a hippie. And he went and started a bookstore. But anyway, she said, all my ills is on Mr. Knox. But anyway, John Knox, this guy was trained in Geneva. But he went to, he was trained there, and he basically was in Geneva during Bloody Mary's reign. Remember Bloody Mary? King Henry VIII, Bloody Mary took over, went back to Catholicism, started killing people. John Knox fled to Geneva during that time. Once Elizabeth came back, he went back up there. Okay, he went back up there. Now, isn't it interesting if you understand history? Today's headlines is yesterday's history, meaning that everything going on today we can understand if we understand history. It's the reason why I'm actually writing all of these things, because if you want to understand where the church came from, where the state came from, the differences in why we are and doing what we're doing, it's all because of history. If you can understand your history, then everything that's going on today will make sense. So, by the way, my one today actually is on revolutions. American Revolution, French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Mexican Revolution. And it's basically going to be on how things came about. It will help you to understand. You're going to see where the church and the state comes in. You're going to see where the church was trying to, take sides, where the state began to use the church to do different things. So, that's all right. But anyway, so what happened was that, he began the Presbyterian Church, or the Reformed Church, in Scotland. Now, Scotland actually became a Reformed faith. They weren't Lutheran. They weren't Anglican. They were Reformed and would actually become Presbyterian. So Scotland. So England, Anglican. Scotland, Reformed. Ireland was what? From last week. Catholic, absolutely, which they still are today. Catholic, yeah. So, oh, by the way, let's go on. Netherlands, which were they? Actually, Netherlands was Reformed and Anabaptist. What about Moravia or Eastern Germany? Lutheran. Italy. What was Italy? Catholic. France. Catholic. Okay. And I'll tell you, what's good to know is that even today you can see the influence even today because of those different things. You'll see that Italy never really went far from Catholicism. Neither did France. Except for I did go into what happened with France with Napoleon and stuff like that. So, all right, good. All right, Calvinism versus Arminianism. Now, one of the problems that Calvin had was the idea of predestination. Predestination, basically, we went through over last week, that, basically that God predestined you and you have no choice. If you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved regardless. Okay? And we went over that last week. We spent a lot of time on that. But Arminian, this Jacobus Arminius basically said, no, we can't do that. That's not what we want. We're not going to, and what he did is he really actually was Presbyterian per se. He believed everything else, just not the idea. And the whole idea is that what it really came down to, of course, they have their five basic things they do, but what it really came down to was Arminius says, you have a choice. Calvin says, you really don't. That's where it came down to. So you need to understand this. Now, if you're going to understand denominations, you've got to understand Arminianism versus Calvinism. Because from this point on, churches are going to be known as an Arminian church or Calvin church. So, quick quiz. Church of Christ is what? Arminian or Calvin? Arminian, right. Baptists, Arminian or Calvin? Arminian. Anabaptists are Calvin. Anabaptists are Calvin. What about Lutheran church? More Arminian, not necessarily. Good. So we're going to get more into that. We're going to go into the Methodists next. All right, so Arminians, basically this guy changed everything. And again, you'll start seeing these names pop up and you're going to start, oh yeah, that's Arminianism versus Calvinism versus, yeah. So, all right, tenets of Presbyterian beliefs. Okay, basically Presbyterian, the presbytery is really the body of elders. Okay, there's elders pretty much run the church. Okay, there is usually a pastor and then there's elders. So that's really what presbytery means. And it's actually the Greek word from the Bible. So most Presbyterian churches are Calvinists, however, some believe in Arminianism. They believe, of course, Trinity, inerrancy of Scripture, and they baptize both babies and adults. Okay, community, the body and blood of Jesus are spiritual, not physical. Who believes the body and blood of Jesus are physical? Catholics. Who else believe there's a physical manifestation, in a sense? One other place does. Lutherans. Lutherans are just slightly this way to Catholics, but they still believe that there's a physical manifestation, in a sense. They don't believe it completely turns into it, but Lutheran and Calvin were really kind of different on this. All right. So, Presbyterian timeline. Calvin writes the Institutes. Wesleyan Standards. So 1643 is Westminster Standards is really where we're going to finally get the word Presbyterian coming in. And then in 1789, the church was first organized in the United States. And there are over 40 million Presbyterians. Now, let me say one thing about the Presbyterians. Now, I know that people, they believe because they're Calvinist, but here's kind of the idea of Presbyterianism. I don't completely agree, but I think it's good. A Presbyterian, a Calvinist would say, I don't know who's going to be saved, but I'm going to teach as if no one, you don't know who's going to be saved. So, and let me tell you something. Calvin, interestingly enough, if you read the Institutes, Calvin came into predestination in the book The Institutes very cautiously. It's interesting you should read it just to see, because he's kind of like, I don't know how this can be. He's like, really don't like this, but but I believe it to be the truth. And the idea was that Calvin didn't think of it as a prideful thing, that I am saved and no one else is. No. Calvin believed that God cares about people. Now, and a true Presbyterian is not going to say, well, either you're saved or not, I don't care. No, they're going to work very, very hard in preaching the gospel. Presbyterians work very hard. And very good Presbyterians out there are going to say, look, we have no idea who's going to be saved. And so they treat it as such, just like other evangelists do. So I do give them credit because I really think they have a good message and they have very good things that they're doing. I just don't agree with that part of it. However, all the really hardcore Presbyterian teachers I've known were actually very, very good. And they're like, you know what, we have no idea what God's going to do. We're just going to preach to everybody, and those who God brings will be the ones who are predestined. And so in a sense, we can understand that. You know, we may not agree, but we can understand to say, oh, okay, well, that's understandable. So it's not, I'm once saved, always saved. That's not what they believe, because a true predestination person will say that is not the way to do it. We have no idea who it is, so we're going to preach the gospel. So I really wanted to say that before we go any farther. All right, next, the Wesleys. Yes, the Methodists. Methodist John and Charles Wesley. Interesting guys. So basically in the 18th century, 1700s, many people, and these guys are from England, were frustrated with the Anglican Church. The state church was really a problem for a lot of people because it became a job. Now, some of you may have known, if you came from Catholicism back in the early times, some of you young people remember this, that going to the priesthood was a job. It was actually a way to make money to go to the priesthood. One boy from every family would at least go into the priesthood, and everybody else would follow whatever. Okay, and Tom's like, yep, that's true. And so the thing is with the Anglicans, it was very much so like that. Well, the Wesleys said, we don't really like this. The Wesleys were at Oxford, the college, and they began what we call a holy club. It was kind of, it's a stupid name, but that's what they called themselves. They were basic because they wanted a deeper relationship with Jesus, and they wanted to do it different. Because remember, by this time, a lot of people, we're still getting wishy-washy Christians. People go to Christian college because that's all there was. And so they go and do their own thing, whatever else. But now these guys said, no, we really want something more than that. So they begin meeting with Christians who wanted a more devout Christian walk. Okay? Now, also, both these guys are musicians, and Charles, and you probably know some of Wesley's hymns, he wrote, I think, like 6,000 hymns. And we're talking prolific. That prolific is not that. We're talking this tree is blooming with fruit everywhere. 6,000. Actually, funny thing is, he played music, but he never actually played his own. Someone else wrote music to him. But yeah, he wrote all those guys. And yeah, the Wesleys were very, very prolific in hymn writing. All right. John Whitfield. Now, this is the guy that, this guy's famous. He was actually one of the guys, he was actually an Oxford minister. He was highly charismatic, and he helped begin the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, that is, meaning that people were beginning to come back to Christ. Now, we think back in those days, everybody was a Christian, everybody loved God. Well, no, they didn't. There was a lot. I'm just reading started a book on George Mueller, and he was saying that there was towns he went in Germany that nobody knew Jesus. They went to church, but nobody knew him. People were just rejecting God. There have always been people rejecting God. And so the Great Awakening happened when these guys started preaching and people started receiving and saying, we want this. Now, the only thing about George Whitfield I'm going to say that I don't like was that he did write about slavery. Okay? I want to make sure, I didn't put that in there, but I want to make sure it's clear. He wrote pro-slavery. None of the other guys are pro-slavery, but he was. So that's the one thing about him I don't like. So, all right. Oh, well, and he was a Calvinist, but all the other Wesleys were Arminian, by the way. All right. So revival. In the early 18th century, revival spread across England and America, the Great Awakening. People started coming. It's interesting. I was reading about like Charles Spurgeon and stuff in some of those revivals. People were like, he was just talking to people down below, and people up in the rafters, wherever heard, and they were like, they just wanted to get to know, all of a sudden, they all wanted to get to know Jesus. I mean, God was moving in people. They were moving. God was out moving and drawing people to him. And these guys did this. Now, they also started open-air meetings that we call revivals. Now, And I know the revival's a little strange, and they did some strange things, and there was a lot of emotion with them. But the key is that they did preach the gospel. They did teach the Bible, and they did tell people about Jesus. What the people did with it was up to them, but they did do that. So, but the key with these guys was they wanted to preach to the poor and unreachable. That is the main tenet of Methodism, the poor and the unreachable. So today churches, a lot of churches, and they do today, and a lot of churches cater to the rich. A lot of churches say, bring it, we'll get you in there, but they're not going to go into the trenches, to the poor, to the thing. The Wesleys said, no, we want to go to these people. And that's what they did. Crowded tenements, most people back in the day would not venture into these places because they were dangerous. But the poor need Jesus. People were unknown and untouched by the church. The reason is because what happened was in the Industrial Revolution, people were coming in droves into the church. Into the cities. And so they built all these tenements, and people were like, they're packed. But yet no one wanted to go down to them and tell them about God. Well, the Wesleys did. So they held open-air meetings with great success, even in the middle of London. So from here, this is where the Methodists really began. They desired to reach the poor and also ministering to the sick. So it's interesting because I was reading through a thing, this one guy that, I think it was New York or Boston, that, one of the guy, there was this rich guy in Boston that in this rich church, and they would go to this rich church and say, why aren't you guys helping out the poor? Why aren't you guys doing this? Well, of course, they all got arrested. Nothing ever changed. So, but the reality was the poor had it very bad. During this time, during the Industrial Revolution, people were working, guys were working 14 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. They were abusing the workers like crazy. Children over 8 years old had to work 12 hours a day. Children had to work. Because what they did is these factory owners would barely pay enough, and most people would starve on just one person's wages. Working conditions were abysmal. We see the kids right there. They don't even have shoes on. Working conditions were abysmal during this time. People who lived like this were not very interested in Jesus. This was not just in London. This was in America also. These factories were all over the place, and they were polluting everything, and people worked in abysmal conditions. However, this is where Wesley's found themselves. So they continued to reach out to the poor, and they taught very methodical ways of Jesus. So they basically, their opponents called them the Methodists. They didn't call themselves the Methodists, their opponents did, because what they did is they basically went to the poor and tried to teach a methodical way to understand. Remember what what is the one thing the poor could not do? Two things. What could the poor not do? Read and, well, if you can't read, you can't write. Read and write. They couldn't read and write. So what they would do is they would teach ways of understanding Jesus even though you couldn't read and write. So that's what they did. So that's the reason why they call them the Methodists. So Wesley's, basically said, okay, we want to try to bring this to America also. They went to Georgia. Not the best place to go to. Not the best place. They probably would have did better if they went up north, but Georgia. So a lot of people in Georgia didn't like them because they were strict and they also went to the poor. But because they were interested in the poor, what other group in America do you think they were also interested in? slaves. They wrote very, very harshly against slavery. They were very, very, very big on, the Wesleys were. Now again, we know George Whitfield wasn't, but the Wesleys absolutely were. They were hardcore against slavery. They actually got driven out of Georgia, sadly. So anyway. So what do the Methodists believe in? The Trinity, of course. Scripture, sanctification, pretty much like most other beliefs. Baptism is given to children and adults. They believe that Christ is present as the Lutheran and Catholics believe. So they do believe that Christ is more present, that not as much like they thought there, like it actually turns into it. They believe that when you're giving the bread, that Christ is present, not necessarily that it turns into the actual blood of Christ. So most Methodists are Arminian, and there are about 20 to 40 million worldwide. All right, so let's go to another set of Methodists. Yes?
Is the Wesleyan Church another name?
Yep, absolutely. Whenever you see Wesleyan, it's another name of Methodists. Absolutely, very good. All right, let's talk about the AME Church, and I wanted to make sure I put this in here. This is important. The African Methodist Episcopal Church. This was the very first, now not the first African-American church, the first African-American denominational church. So that's a big thing. The AME Church, which is still in existence today, grew out of the Free African Society with Richard Allen, this guy right here. See, Richard Allen was interesting because Richard Allen was a slave, and the guy who owned slave owner became a Christian and released him. He went up north. So the owner became a Christian and said no more slavery. Richard Allen went north, which God used that, started the AME Church, and it was a very, very big, it's a big thing even today. There's still a lot of AME churches out there today, okay? So the tenets of AME, now again, Wesleyan Arminian, that should just tell you everything. So they're Wesleyan, which means they're most likely Arminian, okay? So again, now you see how you're kind of understanding how these guys go together. So, but they also Episcopal. So the African Methodist Episcopal. What that means is that Episcopal means that they're overseen by a bishop. So which means that the churches are around here and a bishop oversees multiple churches, just like in the very early church. Literally just like the early church. Because remember, the early church had multiple different things and a bishop was over them. So that's what it was like. So, but their worship is very different from the Methodists. And would be more charismatic. But the reason is what they did is this was a time of release. This was a time of joy. Church was the only time that they could really enjoy things. They would go and have great worship services and have wonderful outpouring of this emotion because they had a terrible life. And they still hold a lot of that today. Now, it's interesting, if you've ever seen the movie Glory, which was basically a civil war where a black regiment actually was included into the Union Army and how they fought. But the movie Glory is interesting. About towards the end of it, before they went to battle, you see the two groups, the white men and the black men, go different places, and the different worship. They kind of hold church. White men are like, black men are like, woohoo, yeah, let's get going. You really need to watch that. I love that movie because every time I think of it, I just love, because it's like, and they would even say how wonderful it was to even be, how much of a difference it was. But you know what? If you live in that type of environment, release is good. Joy is good. Happiness is good. Praising God is good. Being happy with what you have is good. And thus today, that's one of the reasons why they continue to worship this way today, is because of that. So, and also, may help you to see that if you ever see, there are black ministers on the TV, if they have bishop, most likely it's an AME church. That's an easy way to say it. If they have a bishop in it, most likely it's an AME church. So, because they work hard. They're hard workers. Came out of slavery. So, yeah, I thought the same thing. Wow. But that's where they came out of. So, anyway. All right. So, in the end, let's just say that Jesus said, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. This is truly what the Methodists were in the very beginning. This is what they believed. Go into all the world and preach the gospel, and go to those who need it the most, which was the poor. Okay? The poor. And the Methodists still today are very big. A lot of the things that we have in the inner cities and stuff are ran by the Methodists, because those guys were from the very beginning. The Catholics and the Methodists are very big into getting involved and bringing people in and doing things for people. So even today. So I just wanted to leave it at that. Is there any questions over these guys? Questions about Methodist? Questions about church and state? So, all right. Well, this is going to be interesting because this is going to go in. Remember what we talked about? We're going to begin going into America. So this is really the big focus on America, how America kind of got started, on also the different revolutions around us. Now, I will say I added the Haitian Revolution, which really had nothing to do with America per se, because it did happen within this time frame. Can anybody tell me what was the major thing that happened in the Haiti or the Haitian Revolution? What's the one thing that happened in them? Anybody know? Pardon me? Yes, that's true because it's a revolution, but whose independence were they? Yes. The very first black colony who became free. That was the first. The Haitians fought for their independence, and they were the very first to become free. They worked very hard for this. And they worked very hard, and a lot of them died. But you know what? That's why I wanted to make sure I put this in here, because that is important, that these guys fought really hard. And even though I also put in there other countries rejected them after their freedom, they still continued on. So anyway, all right. That's it, guys. Thank you so much. If you need a copy, please let me know, and I'll give it to you.